Good afternoon. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Today is Tuesday, the 25th of March, 2008, and I'm here with Mary Lee Leahy to talk about her lengthy career. And Mary Lee, I thought it might be appropriate. I was trying to figure out exactly how I would introduce you. How would you describe yourself in the career you've had?
As a lawyer.
Okay, that's simple.
That's simple.
Well, you've been involved with several very important landmark cases in American and certainly in Illinois history, as well as some interesting political chapters of the state as well. And we will talk about all of those, but obviously we need to start with the beginning. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your parents and your ancestry?
Well, I'm all Irish. All of my grandparents, great-grandparents came from Ireland. My father's people settled in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in Ishpeming. My paternal grandfather was a miner in the iron ore mines.
And he was the one who came over?
Yes, he's the one who came over. We've traced them. They went from Ireland to England, where my grandfather worked in the mines. And then, after they had 3 children, they came to the United States and came through Canada.
Do you know when he left Ireland?
Well, we know that they were married in Bishop Auckland, England, in 1876. Okay. So we think they came around 1880, 1881. The records in those days weren't very good. My dad was the youngest of 13, and this kind of ties in with their coming. The first time my dad could remember my grandmother crying was when the Titanic went down, because the captain of the Titanic had been on the ship they came over in, and she thought the world of him.
Did she know him personally?
Well, the way my father told it was that the captain would let those who were in the lowest class of the ship up on deck during the night to get some fresh air.
Wow.
So, and then my mother's people came from County Cork to Chicago.
Was that a little bit later then?
Yes, they were a little bit later.
Okay, did they go through Ellis Island?
No.
Okay, so none of your relatives did?
No.
What brought your mother's family then to Cook County, to Chicago?
Well, it always seemed that there was somebody already there. I mean, my father's people went to Ishpeming because there was a brother there, and they came to Chicago because there was a relative there.
Was he mining in England before he came over?
Yes.
So he was still pursuing the same occupation?
That's right.
Do you know why they came?
I think it was opportunity, and I've never been able to figure that out because we've stayed in touch with relatives in Ireland, and there are some that never go more than 3 or 4 miles from home, and then there are those who sail away knowing they'll never come back.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know in doing the pre-interview, you had some fascinating stories that you talked about here, and one of them was one of your relatives who didn't leave Ireland during the First World War era, I guess, or a little shortly after that.
That's on my mother's side. They did not leave. They were very active in the Easter Uprising, and eventually one of my cousins was executed.
Okay, the Easter Uprising was in 1916
That's
during the
right.
war.
But the war went on till 21 or 22 in Ireland.
The fighting between the Irish and the English.
That's correct.
And your ancestor was, what was the relation?
He's a cousin.
Okay.
Probably on my mother's level would be the best way. We've got so many different age levels that we just refer to everybody as a cousin. But there's a monument to him at Cork University, and there's also a monument to him in the town where my mother's people came from, Liscarroll.
Okay. And he was executed in 1922?
I believe so. It was within 2 weeks of the truce, because a man who was arrested with him by the British had shot. And apparently you could not execute someone who was ill. So the man who was shot lived because he had to recover before he could be executed. But my cousin was executed. In fact, he was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed within 30 days.
Executed by hanging?
No, by shot.
Oh, he was shot. Okay.
There was a group of them, around 20, that were all lined up against a wall after they had dug their grave. And then they were shot and fell into the grave they had dug.
Wow.
And that's at Cork University. So there's a monument there over that mass grave for every one who was executed.
Now, this other gentleman that was shot was not shot during execution, obviously. He was shot beforehand when
He was shot during the arrest.
Okay, okay.
There were 3 of them, and one was 16 years old, Patty O'Brien, and the other O'Brien told Patty to run like hell, and he did. So, I mean, he lived. I talked with him at great length about all of this back in 1981 when we went over with the entire family.
Oh my, yeah, those are the kinds of things you don't forget about.
No, especially because it was so close to the truce. That group was the last group that was executed by the British.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also mentioned when we were talking before that, I don't know if it was your grandfather perhaps, who during the First World War tried to enlist in the United States Army?
It wasn't my grandfather, it was some of my father's friends who tried to enlist. I mean, everybody wanted to go, and my father was a couple of years too young. But I remember a friend they talked about, maybe it's Chin Small, because I always thought that was funny that that was his name. He was so thin that he couldn't pass to get in. And so he went and stayed with his grandmother for 3 days, ate nothing but bananas and water, went down and made it into the service. He had gained enough weight. And then they ended up putting him shoveling coal in a ship going back and forth, carrying troops to Europe. Not a good place to be for someone who's real skinny. I always thought the boiler room.
But he was Irish, correct?
Yes.
Now, see, the part that amazes me is that here you have a young Irish lad in the United States who is eager to join up with the United States Army late in the First World War, but you're basically fighting for England's war, essentially, and they obviously didn't have any problems with that.
No. I think the country was so wrapped up in excitement and patriotism, and everybody in the town would go down when people took off to go to training, to go to basic training. It was a big celebration in the train station. I mean, very different from what I think things are today.
Well, let's move ahead a little bit in history. And when were you born?
April 28th, 1940.
Okay, so just a few months. Well, that was well before the United States got into the war, but World War II in Europe was already started at that time. What was your father doing at the time?
He was a Pullman conductor.
Okay.
And my mother was, after she got married, she did not work.
Okay, was he a Pullman conductor in the city of Chicago?
Well, he was with the Santa Fe Railroad. In those days, the Pullman Company was separate from the railroad, and the railroads would lease the cars from the Pullman Company, and Pullman employees had to work on the Pullman cars.
So he did an awful lot of traveling.
His route was from Chicago to L.A.
Wow.
He was gone a week and home a week. And when I got to first grade, I felt so sorry for all my classmates because my dad was home a week and their dads had to go to work every day. I just thought that was so unusual. I didn't realize how good I had it.
And your mother, she was a housewife, you mentioned?
Yes, and then she ended up working part-time at Marcia Fields in Evanston.
Okay. You lived in Chicago proper?
Until I was 10, and then we moved to Evanston.
Okay. I'm just curious because I jumped to the conclusion that maybe he would have lived in Pullman itself, or maybe that was already incorporated in Chicago at that time.
That's right.
Okay. And what was the name of the other community you moved to?
Evanston.
Okay. But I thought
we
there was
lived in
one.
Rogers Park in Chicago.
Okay.
And then we moved to Evanston. I mean, neighborhoods have names.
And for somebody who hasn't spent a lot of time in Chicago, where is Rogers Park?
On the very northeast end of Chicago.
Okay.
It's the furthest north, right on the lake neighborhood in Chicago.
Okay. Now, I wanted to talk quite a bit to you about the medical problems you had growing up, especially at a young age. Could you go into that for us?
Well, I was born with bilateral clubfoot, and in 1940 you did not correct it. The theory was you had to wait till bones of a child grew to a certain extent, and usually that was around 8 years of age. So between birth and 1948, I had about 13 surgeries on my legs. I was in casts most of the time. I think I mentioned this to you. I didn't realize at the time, but how difficult that must have been for my parents because casts had to be changed every 3 weeks, and we're talking World War II.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking a gas shortage. My folks didn't have a car. So it was before the electric saw that now cuts casts off. So Mom would have to get me up at 3 in the morning, put me in the bathtub, soak the casts, then soak them in vinegar and water. And I can't imagine how heavy I must have been by the time they had to carry me to the bus station and then ride the 2 buses, in fact, to get from Rogers Park to the hospital.
And so you said from about the time of what age did you have this first operation?
Oh, I had a few shortly after I was born.
So even before you can even remember any of that.
That's right. My mother used to say that somehow I sensed when we were going to the hospital because I would start to cry a block away from the hospital. And if we weren't going there, but we were on the same route, I didn't cry. And I've often thought about, we had a dog that we would walk by the vet all the time. He was fine. But somehow he knew if he was going there for a bath, and then he didn't want to go.
Mm-hmm. Was 8 the last time you had one of these operations then?
Yes.
Okay. But so those early formative years, your life is spent in a cast. And you've got to be looking at other kids. Your sister was a couple years younger?
Yes.
And that's Maggie? Margaret?
Yes. Well, she named herself Maggie when she got to high school.
Okay. What did you think about all these other kids that were running around on 2 legs and they were never in casts?
I think it was probably my parents who were very accepting. It didn't seem unusual. I can't explain it, but it didn't seem unusual. And I did do a lot of things. I mean, my aunt and a friend of hers took me to Lake Michigan and held the casts up in the air, and I would try to swim. So, I mean, they did let me do a lot of things as much as I could.
Do you think all of that experience has changed you, has affected the way you have your outlook on life?
Oh, absolutely.
How?
Absolutely. In some ways, my mother always thought Maggie and I were just absolutely great kids, and that we could do anything that we wanted to do, and that this was like something that had been given to me that was a gift that I would learn from and grow from, rather than being like a handicap. It was an opportunity. I'm not sure I'm explaining it right.
And that's how you look at it today, that did change you in a fundamental and a good way?
Yes, because it taught me about pain. And I think that makes you far more understanding of people who are undergoing pain.
Mm-hmm.
Because really, when, pain makes you crabby. But then you get used to it.
Now, you mentioned the Second World War, and I know you when we earlier talked, you said you actually remember some of the things like rationing. Is there anything else that sticks in your mind about the Second World War era?
Well, when I was talking about having to go to the hospital for the cast changes, Mr. Loray, who lived above us, we lived in a 2-flat, he would try to save the gas rations so he could drive us once in a while to the hospital. I remember going to the meat market. In those days, stores were pretty separate. You had your greengrocer, and you had your meat market, and you had your bakery. But I can remember being in the stroller. That's how I got around. And going with my mother, and she'd have her book of rations to buy the meat. So a lot of sacrifice in those days as compared to today when we have war.
Well, in your comment about your neighbor, there's a sense of community as well.
Yes.
Anything that you'd like to mention or you recall about going to school during that time frame?
Well, I went to the public school for the first 2 years because first and second grade were on the first floor, and at the Catholic school, first and second grade were on the third floor, and I couldn't make the steps. So after my surgeries in '48, then I went to the Catholic school, St. Ignatius in Rogers Park, and then when we moved to Evanston to St. Mary's.
So your family were regular churchgoers as well?
Yes.
The Catholic Church was very important to them?
Yes.
Okay. How about politics for your parents? Were they interested or in tune with any of that?
Well,
you smile.
My father was a great believer in, we got Progressive and New Republic, and even in late grammar school, I would be reading articles. We'd be talking about all sorts of social and political issues at the dining room table. I can remember when Stevenson lost, I thought it was the end of the world. I'd never known anything except a Democratic president. So it's funny, I think in Chicago, my father couldn't understand this, but apparently if you're Irish Catholic Democrat. I mean, those things all went together in the city of Chicago in 1940. My dad, I think, came to his beliefs much more through study of ideology, and probably his father, because his father had mined in England. And in England, there were certain safety rules, and they only worked half a day on Saturday. And when he came to Ishpeming, Michigan, there weren't the safety rules, and they worked 6 days a week. So, I mean, I think my grandfather was progressive in wanting safety standards for the mines. And I mean, mine disasters up there weren't that all unusual.
Was there a union that he was in at the time, or was that prior to unions being successful? Was he working for that end, though?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. And my dad, was a member of the Pullman Conductors Union.
Okay.
And, of course, the porters became organized eventually. So, yes, the porters and the conductors were unionized.
Okay. And all of that is part and parcel to growing up in Chicago. You're a Democrat if you live in certain neighborhoods and you're certain ethnic backgrounds.
That's right. And I think the funny thing, too, is that in those days when I was growing up, it wasn't so much your neighborhood as the parish you lived in. I mean, my mother and her best friend lived on 12th Street when they were little, and they lived right next door to each other. But Marguerite went to the German Catholic Church, and my mother went to the Irish Catholic Church. So you had your parish, and that was very important.
Were the politics different in the two churches then, in the two parishes?
No, I don't think the politics were any different.
But people otherwise were paying attention to those things.
Yes, because when my dad came to Chicago to go to work for the Pullman Company, he was very surprised at this identity with a parish.
So early on, your father, your parents are making sure that you're aware of what's going on in the world. You're exposed to a lot of different ideas. What other activities and interests did you have growing up?
Well, I think I should comment on something else, because in thinking about this interview, I think it became very important to me, and I didn't realize it at the time. I had a great aunt who was a BVM nun.
A BBM?
BVM, Blessed Virgin Mary.
Okay.
That was the order. And their headquarters were in Dubuque. Well, in the summer, she would be assigned to a parish in Chicago, and she would come for lunch. And of course, she had to bring a companion, and they all wore the habit. And I remember the summer of 1954 when the desegregation case came down from the U.S. Supreme Court. And of course,
the Little Rock, the Board of Education.
Yeah,
the
Brown
Topeka,
versus.
yeah.
And of course, we had discussed it at the dining room table. I had been going, in those days the word was Negro, I'd been going to grammar school with Negro children for 5 years. My mother was very big on everybody in the class being invited to a party. You didn't have your own clique of girls that you had come to your house. If there was going to be a party, it was going to be everybody. And I brought up Brown versus Board of Education that summer of '54. Just gotten out of 8th grade. And Sister Frances at the dining room table said, "I don't know if I could ever teach a Negro child." And I just got furious. I can remember it. And I said, "Oh, you don't mean that?" And she said, "I certainly do mean it." And I went on about, but all children are God's children. All children are made by God. I remember saying to her, "You claim you're a bride of Christ and you couldn't do that?" Well, I got promptly sent from that luncheon up to my room. So I think I probably learned at a very early age that sometimes if you take on authority about something you believe in, you may not win. And in fact, you may get punished. And I think that was a valuable lesson to learn, looking back on it. I mean, my mother apologized to me later on, but I just couldn't. Sister Frances was such an authority figure because she was a nun.
But you don't regret that incident, I would assume.
No, I don't. But I think it taught me something. At the day it happened, I certainly regretted it. But I think it taught me something very valuable.
Your exposure to African American students was in the schools, as you mentioned?
Yes, at St. Mary's.
Okay, so in this case, it's obviously not just Irish Catholic kids or German Catholic kids that are going there. These are African American families are looking for better schooling for their kids as well?
Well, Evanston was different from Chicago.
Okay.
Evanston, you have the mansions on the lake, and my mother saw African American children at Mass the first time she went to Mass, and she went and saw the Monsignor, the pastor of St. Mary's, and he explained to her that those children were the grandchildren of the original servants that worked in the mansions that were on the lakefront, and that St. Mary's encompassed that geographical area. So we had both the mansions, and then we have the servant living quarters on the west of the parish.
And the folks who lived in the mansions were probably going to Protestant services someplace and sending their kids to other schools.
That's right.
Okay. Well, as you're in high school now, and you're getting exposed to all of this myriad of ideas, did it occur to you what you wanted to do with the rest of your life?
I began to debate, and I think that was really important. I went on the debate team in high school as a freshman. Got to do a lot of traveling because of it. We went to debate tournaments, Philadelphia, all over. And that was a valuable experience. And then we had what we would call mock student congresses. And, I'd be elected and go for 2 days and have a lot of fun and debating all sorts of issues. I remember we had a whole year of debating farm parity. I couldn't tell you today a thing about farm parity. It was the most boring subject in the world, but it was fun debating. And I think probably as I got to be a junior in high school, I really wanted to be a lawyer, but I didn't dare tell anybody.
Because there weren't a whole lot of role models out there for you?
There just weren't very many women attorneys. In fact, when I got out of law school, females were only 3% of the lawyers in the country, much lower than doctors.
Were there a lot of other women who were involved in debating at the time?
Well, see, it was an all-girls high school.
Okay.
We're back to we had all-girls high schools and all-boys high schools. We had very few that were co-ed in the diocese at that time. So, and I've often thought about that. Looking now at some of these studies, I am rethinking an all-girls high school and an all-boys high school.
That's not necessarily a bad thing?
That's right, because I've read some of these studies about teachers subconsciously being more likely to call on boys in certain classes than they do on girls, particularly if it's chemistry or physics, that type of thing. And you're not always distracted, I think. So
Nor are the boys.
I'm rethinking that whole thing.
Well, that's interesting. Gosh, where would I like to go with this? I know what I wanted to ask. The debating, was that something you did at the home as well with your parents? Because you described that environment as one where you're exposed to a lot of ideas.
Oh, sure, we talk about ideas, and my father would always kind of egg on the other side of an issue. But
so that all came naturally for you.
Well, see, and you also go back to these, my mother's maiden name was O'Brien, so the O'Brien side of the family in Chicago, I mean, my grandfather won elocution, that's what they called it in those days, medals. That family all went to St. Ignatius High School. And I've got some medals of my grandfather and of my uncles.
Was there ever any doubt that you were going to be going to college?
No.
Okay.
But I did have to stay at home.
For financial reasons.
That's right. I missed out on the debate scholarship at Loyola. The coach had only given a debate scholarship to one woman, and that woman got married at the end of her second year, and he wasn't going to chance that happening to him again. So I missed out on the debate scholarship, but I did go through Loyola on a Pullman scholarship. That was a foundation set up for the children of Pullman Company employees. So because my dad was a Pullman employee, I was eligible to be considered for that scholarship.
Was that a full tuition scholarship?
Yes.
And obviously not room and board?
No,
Okay.
So I lived at home.
So how long a drive was that, or a train or bus?
The L.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what the Jesuits were doing at that time. Loyola is a Jesuit university. But if you were a girl, you had to go to liberal arts downtown at Chicago in Michigan Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a boy, you could go to liberal arts either on Lake Shore campus or downtown. So from Evanston, I had to go right by Loyola, which was 10 minutes from home, to go all the way downtown. But you know, going to college on Michigan Avenue, and the back entrance was Rush Street, that was an experience.
Yeah, that's not such a bad thing, is it?
And I can also remember in those days that girls could drink when they were 18 and boys at 21. So when we would go out, we'd have to pull two tables together, and the girls sit at this end of the table if they wanted a beer, and the boys sit at this end and not have one.
Well, that's interesting, because later in your career, you might be the cause for that changing, huh?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Did you graduate from Loyola?
Yes.
And what year was that?
1962.
Okay. And I think we might have already seen some pictures of you when you were perhaps in a prom dress in high school. And getting off track here a little bit, your last year or two at Loyola, that's the time when most students are thinking, okay, now I have to actually go out and make a living or decide exactly what I want to do with my life. And where were you tending at that time?
Well, I think probably by the end of my second year, I had let people know that I wanted to go to law school. And the debate coach, Don Stinson, sent me over to talk to some professors at Loyola's law school. Mm-hmm. And I remember one, Mr. Vertullo, who said to me, you're going to have so many strikes against you, being a woman in that profession. You've got to go to the best place you can get into. He was just really blunt about it. He said, Loyola would take you, but try higher. And so I was accepted at the University of Michigan, and then found out 3 days later that I had a Fulbright to go to England. So I went to England and not the University of Michigan.
Wow. We should back up a little bit and perhaps put the picture up of you in your debating garb that got on the front page of, was it the Saturday Evening Post?
Yeah, on the left is the picture. They decided that since debating originated in Greece, that they would take a sheet and make a toga out of it. And
so this isn't what you normally wore when you were debating.
No, but anyway, the article was that I was the best female debater in the country in college. And so that's what the article was about.
Well, how was that determined?
Well, I think it was looking at a lot of the national tournaments. And again, there weren't many women doing college debating like there are now. Mm. So it was looking at where we had finished. Then you see they would, not only where your team finished, but who got the best speaker awards during a tournament. So.
Well, that's quite a distinction to get.
It was fun.
And was that a big part of why you were able to get the Fulbright?
I think so. If you want to know the real reason I think I got the Fulbright, because I think, number one, there weren't many from Catholic universities that got Fulbrights. There were 112 that went to England. I think I've got that figure right. But not many were from Catholic universities. They were primarily East Coast and West Coast. So you had Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cornell, UCLA, but you didn't have much from the Midwest. And I really think the reason is that I'm the only applicant that wanted to go to Manchester. Everybody wanted to go,
Oxford or Cambridge?
Yes, or London, University of London. But I guess I was the only one that wanted to go to Manchester.
Why Manchester?
Because one of the professors had suggested that maybe if I did that, I'd have a better chance.
Well, maybe he was right, huh?
I think so. But it was a wonderful year, absolutely marvelous year.
And what did you study in Manchester then?
Political science. I was a history major at Loyola, political science minor, and then did political science, got my master's from Manchester.
Okay. Was Manchester a place where your views evolved in terms of your own political ideas?
Oh, I think so. I remember Jeremy Bentham very well. You know, the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. That was his political philosophy, you know. Spread it around a bit. But I think it was just being away. You know, it isn't like now where you can call people. I got one phone call from home that whole year. I joined up with Loyola in Rome. They had just started their facility in Rome. And we sailed from Venice, went through around Italy, and eventually ended up in Israel after we'd been to Syria, Beirut. So that was a marvelous trip at Christmas time.
So that's how you spent your Christmas. Instead of going home, that would have been probably much too long a time to be away.
Well, see, it was 5 days by ship.
Yeah.
And there was never a thought that you would go home.
Yeah.
You just find something else to do for Christmas.
Now you have to forgive me for these kinds of questions, but did it feel peculiar at all that here you are, a good Irish Catholic girl in University of Manchester?
Well, I lived in the Anglican dorm. And again, it's one of those flukes why you choose something. I chose it because it said it had central heating. I didn't know that that would mean 55 to 58 degrees. But anyway, so I went into this Anglican dorm and didn't think anything about it. But because I was a graduate student, there were 3 of us, we had to eat the meals at what they called high table. And the woman who was over the dorm was called a warden, and she had 2 vice wardens. And so we had to sit.
That's a rather descriptive term, isn't it?
We had to sit at high table with the warden. And about 3 weeks after I was there, I didn't go in for breakfast, and we would then have our big meal at noontime, and then we were free the rest of the day on a Sunday. So I signed out for breakfast and went in for dinner, which was at noon, and Mrs. White, the warden, started talking about how the neighborhood was going down because the Irish Catholics were moving in. And it was sort of like I had heard as a child about the Jews moving in and the blacks moving in. And anyway, I was kind of taken back, and she went on to other subjects. And then about 20 minutes later, she came back to me and said, you weren't in for breakfast. And I said, no, Mrs. White, I was at church. And she said, isn't our cathedral beautiful? And I said, no, Mrs. White, I was at Holy Family. She was so shocked. She told me at the end of the year that she had spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how they slipped an Irish Catholic in on her.
No apologies, though?
Oh, at the end she said she really appreciated my having been there. The halls had a debate tournament, and I brought home the trophy for the first time. So there was a big celebration with that. And I did go to some of the Anglican services, the choir and that kind of thing. So I think by the end, we got along very well. But I think she was just so shocked.
Put you on the spot here. Do you remember the subject for that debate series?
Yes. Should Mrs. Pankhurst have been chained to the iron gates? She was in the suffragette movement, and that was one of her protests. Was I think she chained herself to prevent arrest, and it was so that's what we debated. But debating in England is very different because the audience shouts at you and cheers
just like
you.
in Parliament, huh?
Yeah, just like that. Yeah, it was a very different experience.
Well, that was all excellent training for the future that you had in store for yourself, though.
Yes.
So you came back from there, and did you then, while you were in Manchester, you continued to apply to different universities and law schools?
Well, during the summer between my graduation from Loyola and my leaving for England, I began to date who then became my husband. And so I began to date Andy. And then he wrote me quite often, more often than I wrote him, I must say, when I was in England. And I thought, gee, you know, I've been gone a year and he's written me so often. And then many months later, I found out he'd written a girl 17 months when he was in the Army, so I only got 12 months. But he broke up with her shortly after he got back from Germany.
How did you meet Andy?
I don't remember meeting him. He always laughed about that.
Well, that's flattering, isn't it?
Yes, yes. I think it was a practice debate tournament. He had just gotten out of the Army, and he was going to law school at night. And he had debated. So they would ask the graduate who had debated to come back and judge the debates. And so it was a Friday night practice kind of tournament we were having. And he came back and judged, and he said that's when he met me, but I don't remember it.
So what do you remember in terms of the first time?
Well, I remember when I was a sophomore, he asked me out, and I had just made arrangements to do something else that Saturday night. And so I was sure he'd ask me out again. And it was 2.5 years later.
He did, but a little bit longer than you were expecting.
That's right. So anyway, then when after I was home about 6 months, we became engaged. So I was through my first semester of law school when we got engaged.
Okay. Well, a very busy time for you then.
Mm-hmm.
And you went to law school at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
And I don't know that you told us exactly how you ended up at Chicago versus elsewhere.
Well, the ones that were in the top 5, that was the only one in Chicago. And I didn't want to be away from Andy.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the reason.
So different compelling reasons
Yes,
now.
yes. Certain things drive you in your life that you'll never imagine how the reason that gets you there, and then you take off in a different
Mm-hmm.
direction.
What do you recall about going to the University of Chicago, especially in the campus and those classrooms and the intensity that we, somebody like myself who hasn't gone to law school, just the intensity that we assume that you experience while you're going through there?
Well, let me say that I didn't appreciate it till like the day after I graduated.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was so hard. Competition in my class was so tough. The professors used to comment that in other law school classes, you'd have your group of friends that you'd study with and discuss the cases. We didn't do that. It was sort of the attitude that if I think up a thought and I study with you, I'll give you that thought and you'll write it up better than I will in the exam.
So was this an aspect of the personalities that were in your particular classes?
I think so. And the other interesting thing was that I think there were 6 women out of 139,
Mm-hmm.
and that set a record. They had never had that many women in a class before.
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot again. You spent your high school and your college years being a very successful debater, and that's straight-out competition. So were you one of those people who was there and maybe subconsciously you were competing all the way through this?
I think that was the atmosphere of the class. I think, on the other hand, if there had been these study groups, I would have loved them. Because, again, that would have been a kind of debating, throwing ideas back and forth. I mean, I've known some people in my life.
So that's part of the debating experience as well.
Yes, but I've known people in my life that when you bounce an idea off of them, it goes back and forth, and it becomes something bigger and better than either one of you could have done alone.
Mm-hmm. What kind of law did you gravitate to towards the end of that time?
Oh, I loved constitutional rights, constitutional law. Phil Curlin was a magnificent professor, just magnificent.
Mm-hmm. What about that really excited you?
Well, I don't know when it happened, but obviously somewhere along the line, in a sense, I fell in love with the First Amendment. I think it's the greatest thing. I think the right to speak out, the right not to speak out, the right to join, the right to affiliate, the right not to affiliate, that's what makes this nation great.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow along the way, I really got interested in that.
So now that you are, what year did you get your degree? 1966?
Yes.
Okay. And were you already gearing towards a particular law practice by that time?
No. Actually, it was very interesting that the women, 3 of the 6 went into labor law, which was, again, unheard of. And looking back on it, when we've had our reunions, we've often thought that the law firm is saying, well, if I hire him, he may go to Vietnam. If I hire her, she may get pregnant. What difference does it make? And so for the first time, there were these openings in labor law. So I went with a labor law firm, small one.
Mm-hmm.
My husband was already there, and in fact, the firm offered me it. I did not think about going to work there, but they offered it to me.
Your husband had graduated from what law program?
At Loyola.
Okay. And what was the law firm?
Leitenberg, Goebel, and de Young.
Okay.
It was 3 Dutchmen. And they hired Andy, and then they offered me the job, and I worked primarily for John Leitenberg. Teacher tenure work, teachers' rights, and he was great because I had a daughter at that time, and John's attitude was, well, if you write part of the brief at home, I don't care, just so it gets done. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, very early on, in fact, I was still in law school, John Leitenberg got the Pickering case, and then that became a major lawsuit that I was involved in.
Now, I'm curious about going to the same law firm as your husband. I would think that there might be lots of questions about conflict of interest, but you also did very well at law school, did you not?
Yes.
Okay, and can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I qualified for law review, and I declined it because I had my daughter. And the irony about that is that I had worked so hard, and I had gone to law school during the summers so I could get out in January and take the March bar. Mm-hmm. I really wanted to get on with this. And I don't think they offer summer school there now. But I became pregnant and was going to have Anna what would have been my last term. So I went to the dean of students and asked if I could take 2 seminars, because we had students that we never saw except for the examination. I mean, that's the kind of law school that was. And anyway, I told him I was pregnant, and he said he'd have to talk to the faculty and come back in a couple of days. And I came back, and he had left a message with his secretary to tell me that they all thought it was better that I take that last term off because they had never had a pregnant law student before. And I might fall down the stairs. So I did it. I mean, I was very good about authority in those days. So I took that term off and graduated then with, finished up. I didn't finish in January. I went back from January to March and then graduated with my class in June.
But I assume that the law school was a small enough place so that you were not an unknown quality to these people. They all knew you, and they had drawn opinions of you based on knowing you in the classroom and elsewhere. The people who were making these decisions?
I just think they didn't know what to do. I mean, you've got to remember, when I think about these things, how far we have come in many ways. In the Chicago public school system, in 1966, if you were pregnant, you had to quit at the end of your 3rd month of pregnancy. And I had a friend of mine from Loyola that bound herself because her husband was going to law school. And she didn't want to show. She wanted to finish that semester in June. And everybody was very concerned about her doing that. The baby was fine. Yeah. But yeah, those were different days.
Well, you hit the law practice at pretty tumultuous times in American history anyway. I mean, those next 4 to 6 years, an awful lot is going to happen. So that's an interesting time, I'm sure, to begin a law practice. Teacher tenure, talk a little bit about that as the casework that you had.
Well, the law firm represented the American Federation of Teachers and the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and with other law firms, the Chicago Federation of Teachers. So we had many cases where teachers had acquired tenure and then were fired for cause. And in those days, you had your hearing before the school board, which had already decided to fire you. And that's where the Pickering case came up.
Okay.
So Marvin Pickering was a teacher in Lockport, Illinois, and he wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper, which was critical of the school board, and they fired him for conduct on becoming a teacher. So I got involved working on that case when I was still in law school, because my husband was working on it at the school board level with John Leitenberg, and then the administrative review went to the Circuit Court of Will County. I went out and heard Andy argue that case, and then because it raised a constitutional issue of Marvin Pickering's right to freedom of speech, it went directly to the Illinois Supreme Court. So I worked on the briefs all the way along the way.
So how far along was the case when you actually got to the law firm?
We had lost in the Circuit Court of Will County. So we're now preparing to take it directly to the Illinois Supreme Court.
Do you recall the grounds on which you lost in the circuit court?
Well, the judge was just amazed that an employer couldn't fire an employee who spoke out. Critical. I mean, I can remember the judge saying, "Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Leahy, that if my bailiff sitting here criticizes me in public that I can't fire him?"
Was there a discussion at that time? As I know, this was one of the main issues, and once it got to the U.S. Supreme Court level, that the statements that he was making, what he had written, there were factual errors, serious factual errors, apparently, that Mr. Pickering was making. Was that something that was brought up at the circuit court level?
Well, the letter certainly was. I mean, there were statements in there that were more opinion. There were also some factual things that he talked about in building the new high school. But no, it was his right to speak out. And we lost in the Illinois Supreme Court.
And what were the grounds that you lost there?
That the school board had the right to take this conduct against him, to fire him.
So essentially, he did not have First Amendment rights of freedom of speech as an employee.
That's correct, and that all related back to an 1890s decision in which I think it was the Massachusetts Supreme Court said when a person goes to work for the government, he leaves his constitutional rights at the door. So that had been throughout whatever line of public employment. If you went to work for government on any level, you dropped your constitutional rights when you walked into work.
And was Andy the primary, I'm looking for the right term because I'm not a lawyer here, litigant in this case? Or
well, Andy and I wrote the briefs, supervised by John Leitenberg, in a sense. He would review what we'd done, make a suggestion. But John argued it in the Illinois Supreme Court and in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay. But both you and Andy were there?
Oh, yes.
Okay. How long did you have to wait? Again, I'm not familiar with the specifics of this. How long did you have to wait before you could argue the case before the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, Marvin Pickering was fired in '64, and the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in June of '68.
So it would have been earlier in '68 that you actually argued the case?
Oh, yes, like January, February.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about that, because here you and Andy are still fairly young, and it's got to be quite something to even argue a case before the Supreme Court.
Well, that's right, or to know that they've read our briefs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We went out for a couple of days before the argument, and John wanted to get familiar with the room so he'd feel comfortable. And I remembered that years later when I argued Rutan. I went out and watched the court for a couple of days. And I think the most telling moment was Justice Black, who, you know, we're all waiting for Justice Black to ask something because he's the constitutional scholar. And for the days we're watching him, we didn't see him at all. He had books piled up on the bench, and we saw the top of his head. And then when the attorney for the school board in Pickering was arguing, Black pushed the books aside, and I know Andy and I were thinking, here comes the great question. And he said, "Counsel, where is Lockport, Illinois?" And you could have heard a pin drop. And when we talked to the attorney out in the corridor after the argument, he said, all I could think of was, I live there. You know, I live there, because you're so primed on the argument that to be asked, where's Lockport, Illinois, was so unexpected. So finally, if I remember right, he blurted out something like, well, it's near the state penitentiary, and you've had a lot of cases from there.
Something he could relate to.
Yes. But it was interesting because that was a 9-0 decision. So the Supreme Court reversed the Illinois Supreme Court 9-0. There was no dissent.
I thought there was one who had one qualifier on it.
But not an outright dissent.
Okay. Were you confident? Was your team confident going in?
I always expect to lose. I don't know what it is. Then if I win, I guess I feel much better about it. But I think we were so disappointed at the Illinois Supreme Court. Justice Schaefer was on the Illinois Supreme Court at that time, and he and a justice from California were considered just the top of state Supreme Court justices. And he asked all the questions, and we thought we had won walking down the steps of the Illinois Supreme Court. And then, of course, we lost. Schaefer was in the dissent. So.
At the Illinois Supreme Court level, though, were they basing their decision on U.S. Supreme Court precedents?
They were going by this decision from the 1890s.
And that was a U.S. Supreme Court
No,
case?
it was a state Supreme
Okay,
Court.
okay.
The U.S. Supreme Court had never addressed this issue. That's why Pickering is so important, because it all flows.
It's astounding that it took that long, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Go ahead.
To say that public employees have the right to speak or not speak, the right to associate or not associate. And in fact, I had a case pending in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that was mine, the McLaughlin case. At the time, we argued Pickering. And in that case, 2 non-tenured teachers had tried to organize a union, and their contract was not renewed. And we had lost that at the circuit court, at the U.S. District Court level, so we were on appeal with that one. And when we got the Pickering decision, we just walked it over to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago and asking them to use that as additional authority. And then a few days later, the Seventh Circuit decided that public employees had the right to associate, meaning to join unions. And then another big one in that same era, my law school professor, Bernie Meltzer, over labor law, he said that public employees would never have the right to bargain collectively. And yet we worked on those briefs in the late 60s, and the result was that in Illinois, at least, public employees could bargain collectively.
Did this decision, the Pickering case, apply just to state employees or to federal as well, and local?
All employees.
Okay.
But the federal Congress has enacted the Hatch Act, which puts certain limitations upon political activities of federal employees, and that's been upheld.
Well, I know in my case, being a career officer, we certainly were conscious of the limits of what we were able to do and how we were able to speak out. And I do think that there's, well, I probably shouldn't say this, but there are some differences between serving officers and being a teacher in a school district someplace.
Absolutely.
Too.
And I think the court has recognized that. Pickering was an absolute. Pickering said, Mr. Pickering has a right to speak out. The state can limit his speaking out, but only if they have an overriding interest and they do it in the least restrictive way possible.
Through legislation?
That could be.
Okay.
What it has really come down to is a much more case-by-case analysis. For example, if your speaking out is disruptive, if it interferes with the workplace, then they can restrict it.
But it has nothing to do with whether the statements you're making are factually true or false?
That's correct. That would be a different area of the law.
Okay. Now, I think I read someplace that part of the argument that was presented for Pickering also included a 14th Amendment issue?
That's right, and they didn't have to reach that, but we had raised it, and it's been raised numerous times since, and that is that the procedure whereby the
Due
teacher
process.
who is tenured can appeal his discharge that raised real serious due process problems, fairness problems, because the school board voted to fire Pickering, and his only recourse was to appeal to the school board, but they had already made their decision. So now there's been enacted in Illinois a very sophisticated mechanism for appealing discharge once you're tenured.
But they didn't, the Supreme Court did not find on the basis of the 14th Amendment, strictly the First Amendment.
That's right. I think there's a footnote that makes reference to these, but we don't have to go there. The court's not going to go somewhere if it can get by with deciding less. That's usually my view of appellate courts. They will decide what is necessary, but they won't reach out to decide other issues.
Okay. Now I want you to explain what it felt like when that 9-0 decision came down.
Absolutely ecstatic. It was absolutely wonderful, except we made one mistake. I think I told you this before. We didn't celebrate that day. We were going to wait till the weekend, and by the weekend, Bobby Kennedy had been killed, and we never celebrated the Pickering. We never had the party. We never did it, because Andy and I were working very hard for Bobby Kennedy, and his being killed, we couldn't do that.
Why did you decide to wait?
I think it was as much John Lightenberg as anybody else. You know, well, let's get back to work now. We've had our our hour of celebrating in the office, but now let's get back to work, and we'll do it on the weekend.
So he wasn't necessarily the kind of personality that spent too much time worrying about celebrating in the first place then?
Well, I think he was a very stoic Dutchman. He couldn't believe when he took Andy around the courthouse in Cook County how well Leahy was received, because it's Irish. You know, in the clerk's office, in the bailiffs, and you know, he was very surprised
in a town
at
that's
that.
been run by daily for a decade or more at that time.
That's right. That's right. So he was astounded at what that Irish name could do. I can remember that. But he was a wonderful man. He was a member of the National Presbytery, and he stood up at, I don't know what you call it, but I think it was like the National Convention of the Presbyterian Church, and he made a motion for the church to donate money to the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And they were just, it was stunned silence as he told it. And then they didn't know what to do, but they voted to donate the money. But I think he was very laid back, but he also believed very strongly in justice. Very good-hearted man.
I would gather from talking about the Robert Kennedy campaign and being involved in that somewhere along this process, you and maybe Andy as well decided to get much more involved in politics in a direct way.
Yes.
And can you explain that evolution?
Ab Mikva's campaign.
Okay.
Ab Mikva ran for Congress, and we lived in his district. By that time, we were living in South Shore, which is on the lakefront, but south of the Loop. And so we worked on Ab's campaign.
Abner. Everybody called him Ab at the time?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about Abner then.
Well, Abner was an independent. He'd been in the state legislature. And he was gone to the University of Chicago Law School, had a good law practice, just a very fine man.
Now you say independent, and having talked to a lot of other people about the same time period, and we're obviously going to get to Dan Walker, who would certainly see himself as an independent, but also Democrat.
Absolutely.
And Mikva was also in that same mold?
Absolutely.
So he's a Democrat, but how is he independent? Explain that.
Because he didn't follow the machine line. I mean, he took on Daley's candidate.
And was that the thing that excited you most?
I think so. I think that the '68 convention had a powerful impact.
On you? Or?
Yes. But prior to that, when Martin Luther King was killed, that's really when Andy and I decided we had to become involved. We had to make things better, or try to make things better. We worked the bail bond hearings after the riots in Chicago, after King's death. We worked the bail bond hearings to a lesser extent during the Democratic Convention.
So was your commitment to do something and to make a change based on the Chicago police response to the King riots and the response to the Democratic Convention?
I think it was not the police response to the riots, but I called a friend of mine who was with ACLU on that Saturday, and after King had been killed, and they had said on the radio that, you know, the Chicago Bar Association was handling, arraigning all these people that had been just picked up in sweeps. I can never say that right. But the police would just go down the street and put everybody in a paddy wagon. And the radio said that was all under control. So I called that Saturday morning, and the secretary said, there's only 2 people there. There are hundreds of people waiting to be arraigned. So then Andy and I went and worked that Saturday and Sunday. So did some of my other classmates. And as a result of that, the Chicago Council of Lawyers was organized, as distinct from the Chicago Bar Association. So there was that need. And then I remember I couldn't go in the back to talk to anybody I was going to handle in front of the judge. He had to talk to them for about 10 feet when they were let out of the lockup up to the judge. And I remember one young man was just back from Vietnam. He'd been decorated. He was out on the street trying to get some milk for his child and was just caught up in this sweep. And I explained that to the judge, and the judge then said, well, he should have known better and doubled the bond. So what was the normal bond was doubled for that guy.
Let's just touch base on this one then. How would that judge have been appointed or arrived at being a judge in Chicago in the first place?
Well, he was part of the Daily Machine in those days. We went back and worked Easter Sunday. They convened court at 26th in California. The first weekend had been at 11th and State. But on Easter Sunday, Andy and I went back with some others, and we worked Easter Sunday trying to get the last few people out.
Were there any other aspects of the Daily Machine that really made you angry, that you had serious problems with?
Oh, the way the convention was handled. I mean...
The Democratic Convention
yes.
in '68?
Yes.
Okay. How about the way the
I mean,
the
and you
machine-
got to see that Walker was involved in that, although I didn't know him then, because he did the Walker Report
Yeah. Yeah,
on that
absolutely.
Democratic
And
convention.
he didn't make any friends in the Daley administration after that came out.
No.
Was any of your problems with the Daley administration the way that the precincts were run, the discipline that he was able to impose on people, of turning the vote out, of the patronage system that he had developed?
Well, I really think I got a little bit of taste of that in the MICFA campaign. But then I really, well, in '69, a young man by the name of Billy Singer got elected against the machine.
An independent Democrat.
That's right. And all of a sudden, all these independent Democrats in Chicago thought they might have a chance to do something. So, and it's been interesting to me to see how there was confrontation then, but then how the current mayor, I mean, there's been reconciliation between a lot of people.
So it is the events of the Democratic Convention, the tumultuous times of the 1968 that really energized you and Andy to get much more involved in politics then.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's funny because we were very, in a sense, involved in the church. I think we both began to think we couldn't get what we wanted through that vehicle. Social justice, let's put it that way. But that we might have a chance of being more effective through the political system.
Okay. This occasionally happens to me. I forgot what my next question should be. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. It strikes me, listening to you, that it's Andy and myself.
Yes.
It was a team.
Yes.
Was there any problems that emerged because you have two very involved lawyers married to each other and bringing some of these things home?
No, I think we complemented each other. Before Andy went with the law firm, with Lightenberg's law firm, he had been an organizer for the American Federation of Teachers. And you've got to understand that this is like 1963, 64, 65, when again we're dealing with public employees who don't have any rights. Collective bargaining is maybe sometimes on the horizon. A lot of people join the teachers union to get the insurance, so if a kid fell in their classroom, they felt they'd have coverage. So that the teachers movement at that time was a very exciting thing. But Andy was an organizer. And he always used to say that the organizer is not the good person to be the first president. You know, the guy who organizes the union, he was a field director out there helping organize. But the guy who really does the organizing, the talents needed for that are very different from being the president of the union, of the local union. And in looking back on it, Andy loved the organizing part of it. So he thought it was just great if I was out front, but he was organizing and making it happen.
So what were the talents that you brought to the team?
Well, I used to think speaking when I
You used
began
to.
involved. Yeah, I think. I mean, I really enjoyed when I was campaigning or working on somebody else's campaign, doing coffees, meeting people. I really, really loved that. Whereas Andy was much better at, okay, we got all the precincts covered. You got to make sure that when people are going out working these precincts, they go out in twos. Andy thought that Jesus Christ should probably be studied from the aspect of political organizing, because if there's two of you when you go out, and it's cold and it's wet and it's a primary, and you've got 3 more houses on the block, if you're alone, you'll probably go home. But if there are 2 of you, you'll go to the end of the block. So anyway, so he liked that organizing part of it.
And he was more comfortable with the behind-the-scenes things then?
Yeah, but he was such a gregarious. I mean, juries, I think, loved him. I mean, my debate coach once said to me, he was comparing me to another woman, Kay Dwyer. And he said, when you're together, you're a really good team, because Kay is, oh, come on along with me. You like me so much, you want to be on my side. Whereas he said, you're like, I really don't care if you come along with me or not. This is where I stand. So he said it was a very good compliment.
What I'd like to have you do now is to explain your political philosophy, if you will, at that time. And we know how it manifests itself in terms of your involvement in campaigns, but what would your core and Andy's core political philosophy be?
That we wanted to open up the Democratic Party. We wanted to open it up to ideas. We also were very concerned about the role of the Cook County Democratic Party in terms of segregation. We just wanted to open things up for more ideas, more participation. Not that it had to be done, like the precinct captain who has to go out and has to work the precinct, but if people wanted to, that they could get involved.
Well, that might be a good transition. I know that in 1968, one of the results, one of the outcomes of the 68 Democratic Convention was that there were people in the Democratic Party who wanted to reform how the primary process worked. And I guess we're living that and watching it each evening as we go home and we watch the news and we read the newspapers and such. The McGovern Commission is what I'm referring to here, and the McGovern Commission rewrote some of those policies. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the whole purpose of the rules of the Democratic Party was to open the party up to women and minorities. And we did not see that happening in Illinois, that the slate that the regulars proposed for delegates to the convention were not open to women and to minorities. So Billy Singer and Jesse Jackson teamed together to challenge the Daley delegation.
Okay, now we're jumping up to 1972. So the results of that McGovern Commission that worked after 1968 rewrote the laws, and now 72, 4 years later, is the first time you can really test those.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
And anyway, Wayne Whalen, John Schmidt, myself, and Andy were the attorneys involved representing the challenge delegation.
Singer and Jackson's delegation. What was the original delegation that you're challenging then? The Daley slate?
Oh, absolutely.
And that was selected how? What was the mechanism that chose those delegates?
I think it was the back room. As it always had been, I think.
So the delegates are chosen at the back room, but then they're run in a primary election, correct?
And rubber stamped, yeah.
Okay. Rubber stamped in terms of the machine turns the vote out and makes sure that the voters elect their candidates?
Yes.
Was there a counter slate of delegates that Jackson and Singer had proposed?
Yes. Okay. And that slate of delegates was eventually seated. Although we tried to convene caucuses to select those delegates, and the regulars, I don't know what better word to use it, well, they showed up and tried to disrupt them.
Now I want to make sure I get this clear, because I've read some things that I'm not sure I understand the process. I thought I had read that this counter delegation, this slate of delegates, were not on the original ballots at the same time that the daily candidates.
That's right. And so, but we had these challenge proceedings going on. For example,
after the original primary.
Okay. The National Democratic Committee flew a hearing officer in from San Francisco to Chicago, and we had hearings on exactly how the daily slate was suggested, proposals for opening it up to get a new delegation that was representative of women and minorities. I believe we prevailed with the hearing officer, and then it went to the Credentials Committee of the National Democratic Party in D.C. And they voted to seat the challenge delegation. And then it went to the floor of the convention.
Okay. Can I back up just a little bit here, though, Mary Lee? How was the counter delegation selected in Chicago then, if they weren't on the ballot initially?
In this caucus process.
Okay. And were the daily people involved in the caucus process?
Well, they were involved to the extent that it became a bit physical, the one I was at. It was in a church, and Wayne Whalen was chairing it, and he was hit, fell down on the altar.
Well, that's kind of a
ironic
scene, isn't it?
Yes, and I was really concerned because Andy was at another caucus, and eventually, I found out he was okay. But to back up on this a little bit, there was litigation filed in federal court, and the challenge delegation won at the district court level. I argued it in the Seventh Circuit. The judges left, came back in. They said, stay, we're going to reach our decision. They came back in and overturned the lower court's decision 2-1, meaning that the daily delegation would be seated. And that was the last day the United States Supreme Court met that summer. So we raced back to the office. We had put together a petition for writ of certiorari, asking the U.S. Supreme Court to take the case in case we lost that morning. So I took those petitions. Andy went around our building with lawyers he knew collecting enough cash, because the only plane ticket that was available went from O'Hare to Baltimore. We couldn't get on a flight to D.C., so they wanted me to have enough cash to pay a cab ride from Baltimore to D.C. So I got this cab in Baltimore, and I told him, we've got to get there. We've got to get there by 4:30. This is the last day of the term. And he really raced. I mean, he was going on the sides of the highway. I mean, he really scared me, but he got me there. We get to the outside of D.C., and he turns around and he says, lady, I've never been here before. Where's the Supreme Court? And I knew that the Supreme Court was opposite the Capitol, and so in the distance I can see the Capitol. So we kept going, just following till we got to the Capitol. And of course it was 1972. Things were, I remember, a little bit rough. They had tremendous security around the Supreme Court, and I was passed on from one walkie-talkie to another, and I got to the clerk's office with 20 minutes to spare.
Wow.
And the clerk started laughing. There were many people in the office, and they said, we had bets on whether or not you'd make it on time.
They knew you were coming.
Oh, they knew we were coming. In fact, we were trying to get them to stay open a little bit later, but they couldn't do that, so that's why it was so important that I get there. So after I filed it, then one more irony to this whole thing. So I filed a petition. Meanwhile, the National Democratic Party's Credentials Committee is meeting about this very challenge thing.
Also in D.C.?
In a suburb, outside D.C. So I come out of the courthouse. It's June. It's so hot. It's so humid. It's 5 o'clock. I had trouble finding a cab. And when I got in the cab to go to the hotel where the Credentials Committee was meeting, I'll never forget it. The cab driver said, "Lady, have you ever seen the Watergate?" And I said, "No." I didn't care about the Watergate. And so he said...
Had you ever even heard of it before then?
Oh, probably, I guess. But he said, "Well, I'll take you by there." He said, "You know, we won't charge you anymore because we have circles. You know, our fares are in circles, not by miles." So he's going down, and he points out the Watergate to me, and then he turns around, and it made me very nervous that he wasn't looking at the road. And he said, "Lady, that's the Watergate." I said, "Yes." He said, "You know, that's where they broke into Democratic headquarters last week." And then he said, "You know, I think that Mitchell's behind the whole thing." I'll never forget that moment, given how history unfolded later on.
But you hadn't really been all that conscious of the background of the Watergate break-in before that
Oh, I'm
time?
sure I had read about it. It was a minor blip when it first came out.
The decision that the Supreme Court made then, I assume, obviously was in favor of your brief.
Oh, no, it was much more complicated than that.
Okay.
Our case came out of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal court of appeals over Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The justice on the Supreme Court assigned to the Seventh Circuit was Rehnquist. And so I went out to the hotel. Wayne Whalen and John Schmidt were there on behalf of the challenge delegation in regard to presenting the case to the Credentials Committee. So they knew what I had done, and we just stayed. And we got a phone call. Believe I filed this on Thursday. Got a phone call on Friday that Justice Rehnquist would hear us in chambers on Saturday. I think I've got the dates right. And so Wayne and I called the clerk and said, "How is this handled? What's the procedures?" And the clerk indicated it hadn't happened. So anyway, he wasn't so sure, but we got to the Supreme Court, Wayne and myself, and Justice Rehnquist heard us in chambers. The other side was there as well. And it was a very frank, open discussion. And Justice Rehnquist had been very politically involved in Republican convention politics. Mm-hmm. He'd been Eisenhower's opposed to Taft. So he and Wayne just had a wonderful historical discussion of party conventions, and they really knew a lot about it. But then at the very end, Rehnquist said something to the effect, "I'm the least senior justice on the court. I just don't think I can convene the court to come back in." And there was a similar challenge delegation fight in California. And the next week, if I remember correctly, Justice Berger brought the court back into session to consider the California case, and ours went in at the same time. So we got hooked up to the California case. The sum result was that the U.S. Supreme Court said that the Democratic Party can adopt rules, and it's bound by those rules, which certainly is germane today. I mean, I would bet you that when they just denied the Florida matter, that it was based on that decision. So the party has its rules, the party follows its rules.
Yeah. And of course, back then, you have no idea how some of these things will play out in future decades.
That's right.
I mean, that was a huge decision, but maybe at that time it didn't have nearly, or did it? Did it have a lot of a national attention?
Oh, yes.
Okay. I know it obviously did once it got to the floor of the convention itself. You were not at the convention, though.
No, I was teaching law school at night at Kent.
Okay.
But I was involved. The delegation, the challenge delegation, flew out on a Saturday morning, and the daily delegation had moved to enjoin the challenge delegation from leaving the state of Illinois. And Judge O'Brien convened the Circuit Court of Cook County on that matter on that Saturday morning. and Andy and I represented the challenge delegation. I remember we had to object to Judge O'Brien hearing the case. And I believe the judge he said he was very upset that attorneys of our caliber would think he could not deal with the matter fairly, even though he knew Mayor Daley very well.
I was going to say, let's see, O'Brien, Leahy, Daley, a lot of Irish Catholics in there.
So you don't have to give a reason for it to get a change of judge the first time. You just ask for it. And so we just asked for it, didn't say anything else. It was, I believe, the judge who threw out the fact that he knew Mayor Daley well. But he then called Judge Covelli on the phone, and Covelli was out, I think, mowing his lawn. So Covelli showered, changed, came downtown to the courthouse, and we had our hearing then in front of Judge Covelli. And at the end of it, Judge Covelli ordered, in a sense, that the Daley delegation be seated, that the challenge delegation not be seated. He ordered me to call the attorneys at the convention.
But this decision came after they had made a decision at the U.S. Supreme Court level?
Yes.
Wasn't he effectively overturning that decision?
Well, eventually the higher court
said
said yes.
I'm sorry, I got ahead of the story.
Eventually they said yes. I think they viewed their ability to restrict the travel as being very different than a federal claim.
Okay.
So I did call. I called John Schmidt in Florida and read him the injunction, and he acknowledged that he had heard it. Okay, then of course, I think if Daley had gone to the convention, the Daley delegation would have been seated, but the mayor chose not to go. So the challenge delegation is seated, the convention goes on, and then of course when the challenge delegation came back, they faced contempt charges in front of Judge Covelli. And that's what eventually went up. So we had all these different cases about the 1972 Democratic Convention going in all directions.
And it's not like you can delay the convention.
No.
And obviously what happens at the convention is the Daley delegation does not get credentialed. The Singer and the Jackson delegates do get credentialed. McGovern is eventually selected as the Democratic candidate and then is overwhelmingly in a landslide defeated in the general election. I'd like to...
And by the way, though, these lawsuits went on long after McGovern's defeat because it takes a while to go up through the appellate process.
What I'd like to do now is, kind of in reverse order, ask you to reflect a little bit about the impact of these last two things we've talked about, in the Pickering case and this fight at the Democratic Convention. And since we were just talking about it, let's start with the Democratic Convention. And because it is so much in the news today, it's fascinating to me. I've read a lot of things that suggest that the McGovern Commission and the way the 72 convention played out has fundamentally changed the nature of the Democratic Party and weakened what some people would refer to as that old FDR coalition of Southern Democrats, Catholic working class Democrats, white liberals, other groups as well. How would you react to that comment?
Well, I think the 72 convention, the end result after all the litigation came down to the fact that the National Party can adopt rules and those rules are enforceable. I think that the party as a result did open itself to women and to minorities. And in fact, the first time that it was just Clinton and Obama in the debate, I was watching it and all of a sudden I said, oh my God, is this the result of 1972? And maybe it is. Maybe it is.
Mm-hmm. A good thing then?
Well, being a woman, I sure think so.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to the Pickering case then. The impact of the Pickering case.
Tremendous. I mean, we have a method whereby when a court cites a decision, you can go and find that citation.
Mm-hmm.
And if you open the book to see the citations in Pickering, they're almost endless, because there have been public employee litigation on all levels, from, you know, mosquito abatement districts on up.
Mm-hmm.
And what rights do public employees have? And so that's had a tremendous impact. Although I am a little concerned about the Supreme Court's recent decision on a whistleblower, in which the court said that if whistleblowing is part of that employee's duties, then if he speaks out, he can be punished. And, you know, I have a very strong feeling that whistleblowing is protected by the First Amendment, and that the citizens benefit greatly from whistleblowing. There's a line in Pickering, something to the effect that it's not just Pickering's right to speak out, but it's the public's right to hear. And who better knows what's really going on in government than someone who works for government? So that the public, the taxpayers, have the right to hear what's going on. And so that whistleblower decision of the U.S. Supreme Court disturbs me greatly.
Now, we're going to talk about the Rutan decision at great length in one of the future interviews that we have. But I have a sense, and for what you've talked before and what you just explained now, that Pickering is perhaps what you would look at as the biggest contribution you've made to constitutional law?
Yes, because Rutan is based on the holding of Pickering.
Mm-hmm.
It's a natural. You had Pickering in 1968. You then had Elrod, and it's amazing how all these patronage cases come out of Illinois. But you have Elrod in 1976, where the Democratic candidate wins for sheriff of Cook County, tries to fire all the Republicans that had worked under Ogilvy. And so you had the Elrod decision going up to the U.S. Supreme Court, in which they said, hey, can't fire, you know, non-policy makers. Mm-hmm. You can't fire them because of their politics.
Well, I wonder if we can go back very quickly and look at a picture of you and Michael Shackman sitting in, you know what we haven't even gotten to yet is the Democratic Convention the Constitutional Convention. And I had planned to talk quite a bit about that, and I don't know if I have enough time to really go into that today, that maybe we need to hold that off. But let's go ahead and look at that picture of you and Michael Shackman sitting in somebody's house, I guess.
Yes.
Because you're both delegates to...
Well, no, we were running for delegate at that point.
Okay, running for delegate.
And he was running from Hyde Park, I was running from South Shore, and there were some blocks that literally one side of the street was in his district and the other side was in my district, and so we would have joint coffees, mm-hmm. and that was what this was, a coffee.
Well, the reason I'm mentioning Michael Shackman at this time, obviously, is because I've had a chance to interview him, and he was interviewed because he's brought a lawsuit against the Daily Machine, taking on the machine about patronage issues. That's how it eventually worked out. And you're talking about the same kind of thing. So very much the same kind of work. And the irony is there you are both sitting and hoping to be delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1970.
Yes. And fortunately I won, and terribly unfortunately Mike lost.
Mm-hmm.
But his lawsuit was an attack on the ability of the Daily Machine to force work against him in the precincts. I mean, that was the real basis of it, that, you know, if you want to keep your job, you go work your precinct.
And you're obviously working your precinct for the slate of delegates that the Daily Machine had put up in the first place.
That's right.
And I know that neither you nor Michael Shackman were on that slate of delegates, were you?
That's right.
So
it was very interesting in my district. I think there were 9 of us in the primary, and 4 went on because there were 2 delegates from each district. And so the 2 Daily candidates made it through the primary, and I made it through the primary, and John Chico, who was a steel worker, made it through the primary. So then John Chico and I teamed up to run kind of as a team and combine precinct workers and join coffees, that type of thing.
What caused you to decide to run for a delegate seat in the first place?
Oh, because this was 1969. We've experienced all of 1968. Billy Singer won as an independent Democrat for an aldermanic seat in Chicago. And there was just this tremendous feeling that there was this opportunity. In fact, the irony is Ron Smith, who began by working as treasurer on my campaign, decided he'd run himself. And he got elected, along with Elmer Gertz from his district. So there was this great feeling among, quote, independent Democrats that maybe this is our chance.
That after 100 years of the old Constitution, it was time to be changed?
Oh, yes, was it time to be changed. In 1870, banks and grain elevators were very bad people. And so there were specific provisions put in the 1870 Constitution restricting banks, restricting grain elevators. I mean, it was definitely, I mean, banks in those days were issuing their own currency. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we had come a long way. And our boundaries in the old Constitution were wrong. Not that that mattered much. But there were lots of things about it that definitely needed to be changed.
Did Andy flirt with the idea of running?
Well, yeah, we talked about that. And he decided, and I decided it should be me for two reasons. One, I was working part-time and he was working full-time, so there would not be the financial impact on our family if I ran. And the other thing was that he wanted to be the organizer. So that was why the decision was made.
Would you say at that time you were more ambitious politically? Did you have other aspirations beyond this?
I don't think at that time I did. I certainly think that once the convention was over, we both knew we wanted to stay involved.
Mm-hmm. Well, I assume that you didn't have deep pockets. How did you raise the money for that campaign?
Oh my goodness. I think the campaign maybe cost $17,000.
So pretty close to a shoestring operation.
Yep.
And what were the things that you were arguing for, the platform, if you will?
Well, it was also the beginning of the environmental movement. And I decided to run on that issue because I was in the 30th Senatorial District. We had all the steel mills, 4 steel mills at that time that were going gung-ho. We had the city garbage dump. And so air pollution was a real problem, and nobody was addressing that. And so that was my main issue. And I think everybody thought we were crazy, and then we had an air inversion, like 10 days before the election. And all of a sudden, hey, maybe Mary Lee's got an idea. You know, it's so bad. The pollution is so bad and so smelly on the south side. So
that's interesting the way elections can turn on those things, or snowstorms or things like that.
Michael Blandick sure knows that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we also did a real grassroots campaign. I walked precinct after precinct. People said I should not go on the east side, but I did, and I only lost the east side by, I think, less than 100 votes.
What was the ethnic background and the political background of the east side at that time?
Well, it was Eddie Verdoliak's ward. Mm-hmm. They said that when he heard I won that he threw some chairs. But in any event, it was a very... well, let me put it this way. I had heard that they voted down a swimming pool on the east side and instead put in a few little hills so people could ski in the winter, because everybody knew that African Americans didn't like winter sports, but they did like to use swimming pools. And what they put, Andy and I were walking a precinct and we saw about a block and a half ahead of us a couple of teenagers putting literature in the mailboxes. And so it was just sticking out. So when we got there, we pulled it out. And it was a picture of me shaking hands with Alderman Cousins, who was African American. And it said, "Is this what you want in your constitutional convention?" Something words to that effect. It was a very racist piece of literature with no identification on it as to who issued it. Mm-hmm. So anyway, It was very exciting. And I met the most wonderful group of people my whole life in the Constitutional Convention.
I think this might be a good time to stop today, because that will allow us to open up the next session and get much more in detail about the Constitutional Convention, because there's so much that I'd like to ask you about that. And I know that that was an important period of your life as well. And then we can go into the Walker administration after that, so there's still quite a bit to cover here.
And be sure you remind me, because there was litigation about the ballot placement for the Constitutional Convention. I've got to remember to talk about that.
I will start with that then.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mary Lee. And we will pick this up in probably about a month or so, but I think you can tell that there is much more we can learn from hearing these stories firsthand from Mary Lee Leahy. Thank you very much.